Hi, I'm Steve Packard. I'm an expert in cybersecurity risk. I'm an expert in risk management and corporate governance, enforcement, and of course, in crisis management. And we are now about 2 weeks into the worst managed crisis I have ever seen in my life. I am, of course, talking about the Los Angeles conflagration, the worst urban fire we've had in this country since 1904 with the Great Baltimore fires. Yes, more than 120 years since something this severe has happened. This man made disaster, well, the one thing I will say is that since Cal Fire took over about a week ago, it's been going better in terms of the coordination. We're now seeing the air assets are actually being used effectively with coordination. Initially, there was no coordination at all because they had that idiot Bass running things. So that's better. They've had some rains, which caused mudslides, but that's certainly useful. And they're now actually using some better wildfire fighting techniques because they brought in CAL FIRE and experts who are not just experts in urban firefighting and structure firefighting, but understand how to fight bushfires. So there have been some big improvements, but it still is a disaster that only got this bad because of the poor management of it. So let's start at the beginning, and we're going to talk about exactly what happened that caused this problem. And in order to do that, we have to go all the way back to the 1980s when a lot of legislation was passed in California that put a lot of restrictions on insurance companies. The insurance commissioner in California is an elected official and therefore wants to be popular with voters. And that's a bad thing, actually, because it means that they're going to try to be pushing for insurance regulations that are popular but maybe not effective or fair or useful. The problem is that these laws that were passed in California severely restrict the ability to use predictive modeling in insurance pricing. And they would say, well, they're price gouging people who live in certain neighborhoods. They're discriminating against people who live near wildlands. It's not that. It's that insurance has to raise the rate to make it appropriately expensive to take high risks so that people are discouraged to do them. And so that people will go to their insurance and they'll say, hey, my rates are high. What can I do? Which point insurance will say, well, if you put a metal roof on and you get fire-resistant siding and you clear your landscape, we can talk. That's how insurance should work. But this is broken in California because of their Insurance Act. And the FAIR program that they have there, which is state-subsidized insurance, has resulted in a lot of bad behavior. There's been a lot of building into the urban wilderness interface, which is really the place where this problem happens. And along with that, there have been a lot of budget cuts to fire departments, including in Los Angeles. And there's been some controversy on that because they weren't as bad as they were initially reported. They did get a reprieve. But Los Angeles and some other cities have been really terribly managed. I think if you look at Los Angeles and you see the amount of blight, crime, homelessness, it's true in San Francisco as well. This is a big contributor to it. In fact, a lot of people don't realize how terribly managed these cities are. In addition to that idiot Bass, who was like out of the country when this started to get bad, the deputy mayor was arrested last month for phoning in some sort of bomb threat. Yeah, that's the quality of people that they're dealing with in the leadership of Los Angeles. California has a long-standing problem with budgets, and the reason for that is they have a highly progressive tax system in which rich people pay the majority of taxes. That seems great, seems fair and everything. But it makes it very volatile. It means that if you're having a high year with a lot of capital gains and stocks are doing really well, Hollywood's come out with a few blockbusters, great, you're swimming in cash. It's always feast or famine because it'll be famine when there's a down year or a bunch of rich people move out of state or something like that. And because of that, that's why California is in this perpetual cycle where they will have a lot of money in some years and they'll want to institute all these progressive programs and then they fall apart when they don't have money in the next year to fund them. It's been a real problem in California for a long time, and just the sort of attitude and personality of California, wanting to be very ambitious and have a lot of progressive programs, they've really shot themselves in the foot a number of times. And the propensity for building, because that's how they make money through property taxes and selling property and everything, with these residential properties being constructed out of wood pushed into the wilderness interface. But probably the biggest thing is that there's been a lot of reduction in deep brushing and the reduction in fuel, which is the most important part of fighting a fire. And that's really what led up to all of this, was a lot of incompetence and poor planning. And the thing is, With global warming and the worsening fires we've seen everywhere in California, in Canada, in Australia, it should be obvious that you should be spending on wildfire control. The state as a whole has actually done okay. They've upgraded CAL FIRE, though probably not as much as they should have. But Los Angeles and some other cities have done terribly. There's been no investment in surveillance drones, very little investment in automated surveillance of fires, very little investment in communication. Equipment is very obsolete. They're not properly trained for fighting brush fires because these are urban firefighters, and that was very obvious early on. Things got much worse, although there had been fires burning since the new year. Things were reasonably under control with a lot of small fires until the 7th, which is when the Palisades fire grew out of control. And that's really where it hit the fan, was in the Palisades. It's since increased into Easton. And there's also, by the way, there's fires in San Diego as well. And you'll notice something. San Diego handled them much, much better. You notice that? Yeah. Yeah, they're struggling in San Diego, too, because CAL FIRE doesn't have a lot of resources, what's going on in Los Angeles. But they did a much better job in San Diego. But what happened was that when the Palisades fire flared up very badly 2 weeks ago, the fire department dispatched 40 fire trucks to Palisades, and they sucked so much water out of the system, more than 3 million gallons in a period of several hours. And the water system held up for several hours, more than that, the better part of a day, actually, before they drained all 3 of the gravity tanks. Now, the problem is, even if there had been water in the Palisades reservoir, that might not have helped because it's a gravity-fed system and there are tanks on hills. And there was a terrible lack of coordination and communication between the water district and the firefighters, who should have known that when pressure was going down that far, they needed to stop using it. But by continuing to use it all the way till the end, they actually broke the system's siphon. So they broke the vacuum in the system. And because there are so many breaches in the system, it's been very hard to restore. But they should have known better than that. And had there been more coordination, had the water department told them, hey, you got to stop, we're running low on water, and we can't replenish into these tanks. It's not that they didn't have enough water. There was enough water. It was just that it couldn't be pumped to the tanks as fast as they were withdrawing it. And no system is designed for that. In fact, you can't fight a fire like that with water. You have to fight it by containing it, by removing fire. And when you see these videos where they're not debrushing things, they're not removing things, that just goes to show they're not the right type of firefighter for this. It's nothing against them, but this is against the city of Los Angeles for not spending more on that. This is the type of fire you don't fight with water. You fight it with a bulldozer. You build fire breaks. Early on, they were actually using their wildfire bulldozer, that they have a very large one, to push cars out of the way. It was pathetic. Absolutely pathetic. But it goes to show that with these budget cuts, they just didn't have the training or the personnel to understand how to fight brush fires and wildfires. Thankfully, CAL FIRE and some other specialists are in now. Also, they seem to have established a better communication center. The communications have been much better. The coordination with air assets has improved dramatically over the past few days, although they're still doing it better in San Diego, because of course they are. Was this caused by DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion? I'm not going to say that, and I'm not against DEI in general. It's something that a lot of industries need. Certainly cybersecurity needs to increase its diversity. But they clearly didn't hire the right people. The woman who's in charge of the water service district never did anything to seem to rein that in. By the way, I think I said it earlier, I don't know that the reservoir being full. The reservoir in Palisades had to be drained because it needed maintenance, and this is a long-term project. It was not available. It just wasn't available. The liner in it had to be completely replaced. But as I said, this wasn't a fire that could ever be adequately fought with just water. It has to be fought with containment. Now, these fires, some of them were likely started in homeless encampments, and that's not to put down homeless people, but that goes to show the terrible mismanagement of California has caused so many problems. So much blight and so much garbage and so much unattended brush helped spread this. But this is from years of neglect and years of poor planning, because they really should have realized that wildfires were an acute hazard that was only going up. Now that they've spread as far as they have, it will be a challenge to contain them, but I will say that they are in fact using the correct techniques now. There could be some improvements for sure. There is definitely a lack of communications coordination at certain levels, and there's a lack of statewide leadership. That Gavin Nusram is Where the hell is he? Well, I think he should just stay away from it at this point. But this is absolutely a terrible management issue, a terrible crisis management. From the very beginning, in the early part of the new year to the Palisades fire, everything was done wrong. There was no coordination. There was no communication. The water district didn't seem to realize the problems that were happening. The firefighters were not communicating properly with the water district. They didn't have the proper ways of fighting brush fires. And then when water was being dispatched in tenders, it was going everywhere. There was no coordination at all. And probably the most glaring issue is that the firefighters have not been practice versed and are not authorized in the use of seawater to fight fires. It's ridiculous. There's ample available water in the Pacific Ocean, and no, salt is not so corrosive that you'd be better off having your house burned down. In fact, it's not generally going to be corrosive to the fire trucks because they can be rinsed out afterwards, and there are corrosion protection systems in these pumps, so it won't be that terrible. But it goes to show a major deficiency, because I can't stress this enough. Any place that has the seismic activity of Los Angeles has to be ready to fight fires with salt water or other alternate means. It's not an unconventional thing. Salt water is used for firefighting on many islands and in coastal areas where fresh water is not available. It's not harmful to the ecology as long as it's used near the coastline, because those plants tend to have very high salt tolerances. It's absolutely ridiculous. So they have no contingency planning. They have no training with fire boats, no training with salt water, no training with alternate sources of water. They're very poorly practiced in how to coordinate water deliveries with tenders or what to do when the fire hydrants don't work. But I can't stress this enough. It's not that the system was broken or inadequate when they got there. That's not it at all. The water system was working just fine before this ridiculous demand, which really should have been curtailed, and they should have known to use salt water. They should have been better versed and better trained in that. But my God, 1,001 oversights. This would make a great comedy movie someday of just all the idiocy here. But it is an entirely man-made problem. So also, I mean, I hope people realize that when we build into the wilderness interface, we generally have homeowners who suppress fire for multiple years, and that causes a buildup of brush. If you look at the before and after photos, you can see there's a tremendous amount of dry brush. It's a shame that the city, county, and fire officials have not just informed people to cut down the dry trees and brushes against their house, because that's what causes it to go up. You need to have defensible spaces. You need to have fire breaks. But as I said, they're doing significantly better now. I'm sure that Bass and Nusram, and they're never going to face consequences for this, but this was not caused by a water shortage in general. It was not caused by a lack of firefighters per se. It was caused by a lack of foresight, a lack of budgeting, by putting the wrong people in a lot of leadership roles who are not equipped for it. And really, it was caused by a foreseeably increasing risk in recent years that they just didn't feel like addressing because of the boom-bust California budget cycle, because they had other stuff on their plate, and because of the crisis of homelessness, blight, and crime in California, which has contributed to this significantly by making whole areas of the city complete waste dumps filled with tinder and kindling, and creating homeless camps that are fire hazards. But this is absolutely inexcusable. This was not caused by climate change, although, climate change exacerbates these things. This is a man-made disaster. A man-made disaster. Entirely foreseeable. Could have been detected, could have been suppressed with the proper foreseeable resources and the proper planning, coordination, communications, and good crisis management. None of this had to happen.